Hello, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and on behalf of the Maine Humanities Council, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's panel discussion. How do we keep talking with our neighbors, even when they have ideas that frighten us, even when we live really different lives, and even when we find ourselves surrounded by rising extremism and its very real threats to the most vulnerable among us? Tonight, we've gathered together a group of folks who work with and in Maine's libraries to consider this question. These individuals have a lot of practice with challenging conversations and ideas, and they all champion the importance of free speech and open dialogue. I invite you tonight to hear from them and to ask questions from your own lives about how all of us can maintain strong connections in our own communities. We're going to start tonight with a quick poll of the audience, which should appear for you on your screen. I'll read this aloud for us. At this moment, on a scale of 1 to 10, how open do you feel to having a conversation about a big issue with someone that you disagree with? Where 1 is, I am rarely open to having these conversations and try to avoid them. And you can answer any number up through 10, which is, I feel very open to making room for curiosity and connection with people I disagree with. And while you're selecting your answer, I will go ahead and turn to our panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Preece, the director of the Topsham Public Library. And a shift I've seen toward extreme ideas is distrust of one another and fear.
Hi, everyone. My name is Craig Freshley. I'm a professional meeting facilitator, and I have a company called Good Group Decisions. A trend that I've seen is towards folks being more cowardly. Folks love to hide behind anonymity, and when asked to actually engage in conversation, people seem increasingly fearful of that.
Hi, my name is Heather Perkinson, and I'm sorry, my dog is joining us. I am a high school librarian and president of the Maine Association of School Libraries. And a shift I've seen toward extreme ideas is a lot of not listening, sort of grandstanding and doing things for the likes and the attention.
Name is Savannah Sessions, and I'm a former school librarian and former legislative chair of the Maine Library Association. And a shift I've seen toward extreme ideas, similar to Heather, I've seen a lot of immediate emotional reactions rather than finding common ground and responding respectfully to people.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Sonya Durney, and I'm a librarian at the University of New England, where I help connect students with credible information. And I also moonlight as the president of the Maine Library Association, with a focus on advocating for libraries and empowering librarians. So one shift I've seen is more distrust in society, which I think is really a shame because librarians have historically been one of the most trusted professions. And I feel as though there's a shift towards some distrust towards public education and librarians. And I think that trust is so important because libraries are one of the last places that people can go. And we're just there to help you. It's free. You don't have to buy a cup of coffee to sit there. And librarians want to help you and connect you with the information that you need. So that trust is really important.
Thank you all. And I believe we have the results of our poll that we'll share with everyone here. It looks like a pretty wide spread. We have folks all over the place, anywhere from 2 all the way up through, we've got some 10s in there. We'll ask this question again towards the end and see how everyone's feeling at that point. We'll do a little check-in then. But for now, we will move into some questions for our panelists. Audience members, you can please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as we go. I'll raise these with the panelists, time permitting, throughout, and then we will finish with a general Q&A at the end. So if something occurs to you later that you want to go back to, we should have a moment for that at the end. So feel free. Okay, so to kind of start us off, we've all been at mixed gatherings with family or neighbors when the subject of conversation starts shifting towards something potentially charged and someone expresses an opinion with which you disagree. How do you approach this? What opportunities can be presented by these exchanges?
One of the things that it's important to differentiate between a genuine conversation, or what I like to call as theater. Right now, we're talking about getting along, relating, talking to one another, sharing, and trying to understand one another. The goal of theater is not communication, but winning or disrupting. There's no communication in that. And so that being said, I think we need to acknowledge that whatever topic it is that's come up is complicated. Repeat what the friend or the other person has said. Something like, so let me make sure I understand you. You said, and then in order to hear another person, you have to give them the time to listen and to think about what they're saying. Couple of phrases that I use is, tell me more about that, or and then just stop talking. Be curious. Why do you think that? Let them get their thoughts together and articulate. And be sure you're listening yourself and not thinking about what you're going to say next. So once you know what you're talking about, you could say, may I share some of my thoughts with you? Have you heard about X, Y, or Z? I think there can be a lot of gray area in this discussion. In conversation, it's important to acknowledge that you hear the other person's view. Keep the conversation on ideas. Say some say, others say. I have trouble with all or nothing sentiments. Conversations are slow. They require trust and thought, and only work if both parties are open to it. I was speaking recently to a legislator who said her approach is to say, do you want to talk about this, or just tell me what you think? You've given me a lot to think about. Shall we move inside and do something else when you're ready to move on? Another thing to say would be, thanks for talking with me. I really think it's helpful to share viewpoints. We may disagree, but it's great that we can have the conversation. So that's just some thoughts for me.
I agree with your step, Susan. I have to say, though, I sometimes do find it challenging not to think about what I'm going to say next. And it's not that I don't care to actively listen. It's just that I want to be sure I'm making sense when I respond. So that's such a great reminder to just take a breath and really listen and let what you're going to say after. It's okay to pause for a minute too, right? And think for a moment.
I also love that notion of taking the pause, and because I think we do live in a fast-paced world and we expect answers right away. We are more in touch with people more immediately than ever before, and I feel sometimes the pressure is on to say something back, and of course everybody wants to be heard, and so it's really hard to take that time. And I also just wanted to highlight, I love the point about being curious, because assumptions are a terrible part of life that usually lead us down a bad path.
It's also okay to disagree, to acknowledge that we may never see eye to eye on this, but that's okay. You're you, I'm me. And we can still be friends or talk or see each other civilly. And modeling that behavior would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Susan. We can disagree, and that's okay. And this scenario, Marcella, the way you wrote it, it said we're at a mixed gathering with family or neighbors. And I have found that it's with family or neighbors that are the hardest for me, because frankly, the stakes are the highest. I'm in a long-term relationship with my family and my neighbors. And so to provide some assurance, hey, I love you, man. You're my brother. I'm not going to not like you. You know, we can disagree, and that's not going to change things between us. And literally to say words like that provide assurance that this is not a make or break our relationship kind of thing. Our relationship is way stronger than that. I just don't agree with you on this point, and that's okay.
I really love the idea of asking people what they want from the conversation too. I think that's really important. You know, what is your goal here? And being upfront and clear. We are going to disagree, and you're not, you know, I'm not in this to win or lose or to be right or wrong, just to hear you out because different points of view are helpful.
I just want to take us into a slightly deeper layer. We've actually had an audience question that I think is a good one for you all to consider in light of this, in light of the people that you're talking to being somewhat close, you know, friends, neighbors, family. What if they're saying clearly racist or sexist remarks, and it's hard to hear these things? You know, how do you approach is it another you do you moment, or what do you do, and how do you take care of yourself in that situation?
I think that one of the things that we have to get used to doing is to say, you know, I'm really not comfortable with this conversation. And can we talk about something else? I think that we don't have to prove anything but to just say, this is not something I feel like talking about.
I love how you started with the word I, Susan. I'm not comfortable talking about this. I think that I am always allowed to protect myself and keep myself safe. And I don't have to subject myself to things that I find deeply offensive. And when I'm in that situation, I'm allowed to speak for myself and stand up for myself and make a grown-up choice about what conversations I want to participate in and which I don't, without judgment against the other person. I'm not putting them on the defensive. I'm not making a comment about them. I'm simply speaking for myself and doing what I need to be okay with myself.
And I have a similar, but maybe a different spoke on this wheel thought about this, where when that happens to me, I think about personalizing it if I'm comfortable with the person I'm speaking with, and, you know, thinking about neighbors and people that we see on a regular basis. You want to have a peaceful relationship with people, but I think it can carry some weight when you say, you know, I am a woman. And when you say something like that to me, like that someone wasn't physically strong enough because they're a woman, or I need a few good, strong men to do this, something like that. I maybe it's because I enjoy debating with people, but I think it's important to say, you know, I want you to know that what you said directly and personally impacts me for this reason. And I'm not trying to be preachy about it or go on and on about it, but just, I think people, when reminded, tend to be empathetic and tend to care that they're hurting your feelings. And they can't know they're doing that if you don't tell them.
I think that's a crucial piece too. Sorry, Sonya. You know, that you always have to assume best intentions. And so reacting to something offensive by saying, that makes me feel this way, and I'm sure you didn't mean to make me feel that way, but that's how that word affects me, or that expression, or whatever it is that has offended you.
I agree with everything everyone said. I think it is important to practice self-care in these situations, but I also feel we have a role if we're talking about a setting where we're maybe with neighbors or families, that what if someone is saying something sexist or racist, it's going to impact other people in the room too. And how can we be an ally to them without raising this to an uncomfortable level? So I would ask you all how you would handle that. I mean, what comes to mind for me is just saying that I don't think this is an appropriate conversation for us to be having at this point. And I would respectfully ask that maybe we could talk about something else and try to change the topic. Again, I'm picturing that I'm in a room with like neighbors or family. I don't know what advice you would all have to responding to something like in that situation also. When it's maybe not us who are personally offended, but worrying.
One thing that's interesting that I'm hearing all of you say on some level is you are actually saying something. I think sometimes in a moment like that, you can be a little bit shocked into silence. And so I think it is an important point that you're raising, that you're not ignoring the comment and just letting it disappear or dissipate. You are actually acknowledging it, even if you're also at the same time saying, but I'm not going to engage. So that is interesting. None of you did say that, ignore it.
I
Yeah.
definitely have that inclination sometimes, though, where I'm like, I just want this to go away. Like, but I think, in over time, and especially in the last few years where people with strong opinions that I don't agree with seem to have not a lot of self-consciousness about sharing their strong opinion. So I'm trying to embrace that energy and say, like, I'm going to be kind, but I can also tell you what I think, and you can take it from there. I will leave this door open, but it is definitely I think there's a pull to just like shut down sometimes because it is uncomfy.
But curiosity has a role here too. And one practical advantage to being curious is it gives me a little time to think. Let's say that I'm confronted or I overhear in the stacks, this comment that offends me. I can say, "Wow, really?" Or just something like that. I haven't really said anything, but I haven't walked away. I haven't ignored it, and I've given myself a few minutes to think about this. Or Susan, your counsel, just say, "Huh," and leave it at that. You don't have to say much, but say something, and that buys yourself a little bit of time, a little bit of space to think about this. And then I might take the next step and kind of own it and say, well, I just find that shocking. I'm not used to hearing things like that. That's all I got to say. And that buys me a little more time, and it gets to see their reaction. And I'm in a very non-threatening way inviting them into a conversation.
Because no one ever changed their position by being patronized or called a name or having an accusation thrown at them. The ideas can lead us to anger or passionate statements. But if we can take that breath, as Craig is mentioning, and pull it together and breathe, that actually makes a big difference.
I'd like to shift us all into another thought experiment. So let's say anyone in the audience, are on a public school board, and you get a message on Facebook from a parent demanding that the book Genderqueer be removed from the school, to the school library, because pornographic content does not belong in schools. This is the message. This message makes your heart race, okay? Because in this scenario, because you've personally learned so much from this book when you read it. You also believe that parents and not schools should monitor what their children read. And you hate conflict. How do you react to this?
So for those of you listening at home, we agreed that I would take the lead on this one. So here I go. First of all, the third thing, I hate conflict. And back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, I don't have to engage with this person. I'm just reminding myself that I do have a choice. If this is going to cause unreasonable anxiety for me, I can simply remember this was a message on Facebook. I can say, thank you for your comment. Thanks for reaching out. And I don't have to engage further. Me personally, if I do muster up the courage to engage further with this person, I would invite them to a conversation, either by phone or in person. And now that might stop the conversation right there. Back to my opening comment about cowardice. You know, I hate to say it, but in my experience, just taking an online comment or conversation and then turning it to, would it be okay if I called you about this right now? Or could we meet sometime in the next couple days about this? I won't hear anything else from that person. We'll be done. And in my mind, in my way of thinking, if we're done at that moment, that's fine with me, because I have no energy to converse with somebody in writing, and especially in the case where I don't know them or they might be an alias. I don't, you know, I can't stand investing my emotional energy in talking with somebody who's not being straight with me in terms of their identity. I have no patience for that. So I would try to well, invite them to a conversation. Well, that's an interesting comment. I'd like to learn more about that. Could we have a phone conversation? Or could I be willing to meet with you if you'd like to share more of your thoughts with this, you know, about this with me, something like that. And I would be genuine, even though I have a strong opinion that this book should not be banned. I want to be genuine about learning why they feel the way they do. I'd like to learn more about that. That's a genuine statement. That's not a trap. I'm not trying to bait you and then slam you. I genuinely want to know, why is it that you think this book should be banned? Because I've learned that this kind of thing is a golden opportunity for me to learn. It's for me to learn about what drives people who think differently than I do. And the more I learn, the more I can, to be blunt, the more I can combat that. And the more that I can, you know, work to my own advantage, the more I know about my enemy. I sound like a general espousing war tactics, but if you're at war, and some of us feel that we are, learning all we can about the motivation of our adversary is not a bad thing. But no matter the reason, I genuinely want to learn. And I would meet, if I had to meet, I would meet in a public place. And meet where there's food, or, you know, things that remind us that we're human. If I talk on the phone, I would start with the weather or something else about the school, right, that we have in common. Wasn't that, did you see the play last night? Isn't our football team doing great? Begin the conversation with things that I know that we have in common. And from there, adopt a position of curiosity. I feel like I've talked too long. I want to stop, but I just want to offer this phrase. I can be curious about your beliefs without having to change my beliefs. And it's so helpful for me to keep that in mind.
I was just going to mention that, you know, I had an experience here in the library where I had a grandparent come in and say to me, she was concerned about this, a series called The Suicide Squad. And she was angry and said, this does not belong anywhere in the library. You should not have this book. And so we went into my office, we sat down, we talked, and in the course of conversation, I realized that she mentioned that her granddaughter had tried to commit suicide. So clearly what she was reacting to was something very different than what I was reacting to. So we talked. And at the end, as in Craig's example, we talked about other things. We talked about things in the community here, and we agreed to disagree. Fast forward 7 or 8 months, the same lady knocked on my door and said, "Can I chat with you for a quick minute?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "I just wanted to tell you, I realize now what it was you were saying. I don't want to ban books, and I don't think that that's a good idea." And and we talked some more about it. And she said, "I'm kind of embarrassed." I said, "I don't think you should be embarrassed, because you were a grandma worried about your kid." I mean, sometimes that's the motivation, and it's not about a bigger issue.
I appreciate you sharing some of your tactics, Craig, because I think that's one thing that I've struggled with is I'm confronted with a situation and then I'm like, okay, but now what do I do? And I think inviting somebody in and then meeting in a public place, people behave very differently behind a keyboard than they do across a table from you.
Mhm.
And I just love that. Yeah, get a bite to eat together. Go for a walk through a public space and find something you can both appreciate. And that's an amazing platform to start from. And I just love that, building a toolbox of strategies to address concerns and have these hard conversations. So I'm gonna put that one in my toolbox, because I think often I don't work in a library anymore, but you're behind the desk. And so there's that barrier where someone comes to talk to you, and whether it is truly a barrier or not, it looks like one. And so removing that and finding a place where you can be together and talk is a great suggestion.
I also like what you said, Craig, about sort of getting to know their points and why they disagree with you. And I wish I had taken debate class in high school. I teach a section of citizenship at my job now, and one of the activities the students do is a debate. And they learn so much. Sometimes students have to go on the team with the point of view that they don't align with, but they have to study those points of view, and they always wind up coming back and saying, wow, I really understand a lot better now why folks feel this way, but they were on the side they didn't originally want to take. So I feel like they almost learn more than the students who are debating for the point they believe in. Mm-hmm. So I wish every student had to take debate class.
I think anytime you can bring the conversation to just two people and take away a bigger audience, it's going to be a more productive and civil conversation. Facebook, it doesn't, whether it's a private message on Facebook or whether it's posted in a group on Facebook, they're not just speaking with you. And they're not speaking with you at all. They're speaking at you and
Yes.
To a wider audience.
Heather, I remember your opening comment was about that. A trend that you've seen is more towards grandstanding. And this happens on social media, and this can happen also in public places, in a public meeting, where really the person is not talking to me at all. They're talking in front of a bunch of other people. And I'm just a vehicle. I just happen to be the convenient target that they get to use to show off in front of other people, but really their message is not for me. And if I can recognize that and not buy into that and not provide a continuing platform for that, I'm doing a good service.
One thing that I hear all of you saying is, if somebody is coming with an extreme opinion, you're not countering with an extreme response. right? You're taking it in smaller steps. You're kind of setting the pace. You're resetting how this conversation is going to go, and it's an interesting strategy, right? Because you're de-escalating in a way by doing that. And we had a question come in that I think is an interesting one, because you're all addressing extreme opinions. But do you have strategies or things to add to the toolkit when the information that is coming at you is disinformation, so false information? How do you address that?
With accurate information, to the best of my knowledge. I
Like a
would
librarian.
I would counter that and ask the person where they came across this information, what led them to believe that, establish my credibility, and well, I work as a librarian, and if it's a topic I know about, of course, and this is my area of specialty, and here's my understanding of the topic, and this is where I've been pulling this information from. So sort of establishing credibility, understanding their point of view, and then giving factual evidence if I have it, or maybe I don't, because I don't know everything, but I'm going to look into that a little bit more and let me see what I can come up with. Or there's definitely room. We don't want to be giving microphones to misinformation.
It's also a fine line between misinformation and point of view. And I think that, you can look at a variety of facts from many different perspectives. And so sometimes even just trying to find out where this came from and under what circumstances they found it, can help. Librarians really like to be able to give you a chapter and verse about where you've gotten your information from, and look for solid core resources. But that's not always how people will come to you. And explaining what librarians like to do sometimes helps a little bit.
Another thing, as hard as it might be, is to give such a person some credibility and validate their comment. I can understand how you might think that way. A lot of people have developed that belief. You know what I mean? Give them a break. Let them know that you don't think of them as a bad person just because they got something wrong. And then, lean in with Sonya's approach. But here's what I've learned. But I have learned time and time again that to have any hope of a good relationship with my adversary, or convincing my adversary, I first have to build credibility. I first have to show them that I'm actually not their enemy, that I value them as a person, and I can see why they would believe that, whether I know it to be true.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're talking about libraries a bit, and let's shift a little bit deeper into libraries for a moment, since they're at the center of a lot of these difficult conversations right now. And let's give our attendees some background information. So librarians choose the books and the programs that take place at their libraries. So what does that mean? Are librarians gatekeepers for what's appropriate for a community to read or to experience? How does that work? And has that changed at all over time?
Librarians, they're all different kinds of librarians, and they're all different kinds of libraries. They're libraries. Some businesses have libraries, law firms have libraries, hospitals have libraries, schools have libraries, towns have libraries. Each of these libraries has a different mission, and the librarians who work there have different responsibilities to fulfill that mission. And so when they're choosing resources for the library, whether they're books or reference materials of some kind, digital materials, they're weighing the needs of the people who use that library. Now, as a high school librarian, I think very carefully about the things I purchase. It will depend on what courses are being taught from one year to the next in my school. You know, if a course is no longer being taught, then maybe I don't need to carry that topic. And so I'm not going to buy, I might not get rid of the books I have on that topic, but I might not buy new ones. So yes, in some ways we are gatekeepers, but gatekeepers sound, you know, a gate is an obstruction, and we're more about opening access and providing paths to information. And we are also about offering lots of choices. So, you know, we want to have as many perspectives as we can, but we also want the information that we offer to be current and factual and not lead people to mistaken beliefs.
And so much of it really comes down to knowing your community, whether it's your college community, your actual community, you're a public librarian. So if you have a lot of folks who speak French in your community, you're not going to buy a ton of Spanish books. You're going to, like look at what people are reading, what's circulating, what programs people are showing up for. Of course, you want to find diverse viewpoints on different topics and make sure folks are represented, but also you want to provide your community with what they're using, what's circulating. So that's a huge piece of it. Our budgets are limited. We can't purchase every book that has ever been printed. So sometimes we do have to make hard decisions, and we do that based on our best knowledge of our community's needs.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I first of all, I don't know how intimately any attendees know the Maine library community, but we have a huge range of librarians working in the state. Some people have master's degrees and are professionally trained. Other people are volunteers who are just trying to do their best and figure out how to provide this service to their community. And across that spectrum, I cannot think of a person who doesn't consider their role in their community and think about developing a collection for the folks they serve. And many people are thinking about who isn't coming to my library yet, and what would it take to get them to come to this library. And sometimes that's very explicit, but sometimes it's just one person sitting in their quiet library 5 hours a week, like ruminating on this. And so I think it's just a great opportunity for conversation with whichever library staff you interact with, getting to know each other, because that improves the services you receive. And again, it's just positive community building. And I personally love all those little informal interactions that really can shine light on what people want from the library. And of course, in the school library, we have different functions, as Heather said. So, it's not quite like that in the school library, but the community I worked in was very rural, and lots of people liked books on ATVs and hunting, and those books circulated. So I'm going to buy those books. Do I have a ratio? I'm not thinking about that stuff. I'm like, what books do these kids want to take?
I was just going to say, reading is social, and people think of reading as, oh, it's just me and the book, solitary, but we are very social creatures, and reading is much more than just you and the book. And librarians love to talk about books with their patrons and their readers, and that is part of how we do our job. It's by knowing our community and our readers.
I was just going to mention that as a public librarian, we have a collection development policy, and we don't make decisions in a vacuum. We have a board of trustees that help guide us. We look at what our community wants, how our community is made up, and And it's not just one person's decision sitting and choosing which books are. We have a variety of people looking at the same information about our books. And I think that that makes a better collection going forward. We are a medium-sized library. We don't have a huge reference collection, but we really do have a lot of popular fiction here and kids' books, because that's what we are asked for.
And I think what you all are describing too is definitely to get at the part of the question that's, how have things changed over time? I think this shift into really listening to what the community is asking for and is observing what the community is doing, reading local news to pay attention to what the community cares about. This is shift that's happened over time in libraries. And so that gatekeeping role, I think, is an older model. I think there is a little bit of a stereotype that librarians only collect quality, whatever that might mean. And that they are the arbiters of what that means, right? In terms of what the community deserves to read or what have you. But it's a lot more community responsive. And so so I appreciate you all weighing in with that. I think every single one of you said community. So to shift us back to, the uncomfortable conversations again, what if you find yourself in a conversation with someone and now let's open this up. You're talking to your dentist. You're talking to, a neighbor walking their dog. It can be anyone. And what if they are uncomfortable or they're talking about, challenging or banning or censoring a book that you also don't like or you don't really care for? How do you approach that?
So yeah, I have been just thinking about this because I think as human beings, and I think based on some of these questions we've seen in the Q&A, a lot of us are thinking about how our beliefs impact other people around us. And so if I've had someone say to me like, "Oh, I'm so glad they got rid of this book." And in my heart, I am like, me too, because I don't want to read that book either. But I think it's another example of a time when it's really important to pause and reflect on the broader implications of a choice like that. So, there's been a lot of change in school curriculum to modernize the canon that students are reading and learning from, because the world has changed. And some book I personally have been very happy to see, move on. And so I was thinking about what I would do in this situation. And I think two things that are anchoring me down are that intellectual freedom is not a one-way street. So just because somebody wants to ban a book that I also don't like, that is still censorship, and that is going against something that I really believe in my core to be a civil right to have access to information. And so I think just remembering that, intellectual freedom goes both ways. Sometimes you disagree, sometimes you agree. People have an example that's been used to counter genderqueer that I've seen frequently is the Bible, because the Bible includes all kinds of topics that parents have listed as concerns in genderqueer. But it's not a concern in the Bible. So those kinds of things, it's just really important to remember that all ideas have a place and you don't have to agree with it. And what an opportunity if a patron borrows a book that you also don't like, and they're like, I'm going to read this because I heard that this book said this, and I want to know what this is about. That's an opportunity to say, you know, like, does this author have the right to publish their opinion of, and if a publisher, like, there are so many layers of things that happen to a book before it ever even gets to a library. Like, somebody somewhere along the line has read this book and said, this is a publishable piece of work. So just remembering that, like, the author is entitled to have their opinion, to write their opinion, and people are entitled to consume that information if they choose to. So yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. And then as a librarian, I also think a lot about self-censorship, because sometimes books come out that I am like, I don't want to buy that book because I vehemently disagree with this as a matter of principle. I think this person's opinion is wrong. I think it's based in a conspiracy theory or something that's not true. And it is tempting, or I want to avoid a conflict. So I'm not, if I were a high school librarian and I said, I'm not going to buy genderqueer because I don't want to have to deal with people challenging that book and causing problems. So I think, especially lately, librarians are thinking a lot about self-censorship, and thinking of Heather's question that she just talked about. Who is my community and what do they want to read? And whether or not I like it is really not my job as a librarian. My job is to assess materials and provide my community with what they're asking for, and to be nimble and change when those needs change, because communities are living beings and they're changing all the time. So I guess that was kind of what I was thinking if I got approached about banning a book that I also didn't like.
If I could keep going with the intellectual freedom thread for a second, just for, I don't know if that's more library jargon, but just for those who aren't librarians, it's the right to hold, receive, and disseminate ideas without restriction. So everyone is welcome to receive information on any topic they want to. And I can share that the Maine Library Association, we have an intellectual freedom committee, and they will work with a lot of libraries and librarians who are facing challenges and write letters of support or come to school board meetings, however we can help these. And there was a challenge last year with a book that many of us on the committee and the executive board did not find to be something that we personally would want to read. It offended our personal points of views, but we still wrote a letter to the board and said that we did not think that book should be banned because of intellectual freedom. So even though all of us found the book to be distasteful, we still thought that if that director bought that book and it had its place on that library shelf, there was no reason that it should be taken off. So intellectual freedom, as Savannah said, does go both ways. And I just wanted to share that's how that happens in practice too, and hopefully most cases.
And earlier, Susan brought up the point of policies, and I think this is another example of why it's really worthwhile to go through your collection policy and set objectives that are available for anyone to look at. And when something comes up as a challenge, if you point them to reference the policy, if it's well done, you can, even I have gone back to read my own policies before and be like, okay, you got to accept it because it is within, my policy.
Mhm.
Which is not very fun or exciting to think about, but it really is a useful tool.
Well, a policy represents the thinking of other people, and this gives me a chance to say you don't have to go it alone. It doesn't have to be just your decision. And if anybody is faced with a decision to buy a book or not, or have a difficult conversation, you don't have to go it alone. Check in with somebody else. It can be so helpful to have a colleague or a policy represents, you know, opinions of a larger group of people, a board, a friend. Hey, do you think I should talk with this person? Hey, can I try out some ideas on you first before I go have this harder conversation? I'm just reminding us that we never have to go it alone.
And actually, we have an audience question that moves us a little bit away from that, but I think it's interesting, given how you all are talking about policy. But for an everyday person who isn't a librarian, who isn't working in a library, you know, how might they handle a situation where someone is complaining about books that are in either a school or a public library that have, you know, potentially controversial topics that they maybe don't want their community or their family or children, you know, in the community exposed to? They believe that there's a role for society to protect, you know, the community, other children from these topics or from these ideas. You know, how do you address that idea?
I make a distinction between misinformation, so actually things that are untrue and are going to be harmful in that way, and different perspectives and opinions, right? So especially in a school library, I don't want to have people misinformed. So that's where I think of protecting my patrons and my readers. Another librarian I know recently pointed out in a school board meeting that in libraries, we don't force anybody to check books out. We offer the information as a choice and as options, but we're never forcing it on people.
The other thing that I was thinking about with this question is, you know, what is the mission of your institution, whatever it is, a school library, a public library, and while someone may feel that it's not, that whatever the item is or the subject is not appropriate at any particular time, if the mission of your institution is to provide access to information, then again, to Heather's point, we're not forcing you to come in and look at that, but we are fulfilling our mission to be a place where people can find information.
As a former educator, just quickly, you know, I thought a lot about the loss of so many local newspapers over the years. And I recall in school, we often would get the local paper and we would either write article summaries, but we were interacting with the newspaper in a way that I think many of us have a strong foundation of what is news, what is opinion. And I think there's been some loss of that over time. And that's where it gets a little gray, where it's like, well, this book to me has misinformation, but the misinformation is being expressed as an opinion. And people are entitled to have a misinformed opinion, as frustrating and painful as that can be, you know. And I'm not saying that libraries should be collecting books full of misinformation, but we know as we've collected the book that this is an opinion. This is, you know, a memoir or, you know, just somebody's philosophy. I'm not smart enough or qualified enough to police everyone on earth what they believe and what they put in a book. So, yeah, I think about that layer as well.
The other thing is we are still a democratic society, you know. We are founded on multi lingual, multi-discipline, multi-heritage. And so your particular belief system is perfectly acceptable in this country. Where we run into problems is when you say, I can't I can't see it or hear it or use it. That's what democracy is. It's messy.
And I think also when you're talking about children, I'm a parent. So I watch what my child reads and I help him pick out books, and I have the right to guide his decisions, but I don't have the right to decide what other parents can have access to for their children. We all have different lives, different situations affecting us, and what my family may not need to read, another child might need to read about that situation or scenario, and it could be life-changing for them.
If I can move us a little bit, one thing we opened with tonight was discussing how you can actively listen to viewpoints that are not your own. But there will be times where you want to make a case for your perspective. How can you advocate for your point of view in a civil way? Strategies from the panel.
Well, I'll keep running with my parent hat on because that's come up for me recently in talking with parents at school functions and hearing a parent say that they wanted to talk to the librarian about a book their child had and how they were very upset and their approach to it. So I, thought back to, Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People sort of steps, and like, this is when I'm going to debate, like I always try to establish credibility. So I let them know I'm a parent too, and I'm also a librarian. So I really thought long and hard about, what I'm going to share with you about my opinion on your opinion, on my opinion, well, our conversation. So, I definitely want to find common ground there, as we've all mentioned numerous times. What do we have in common? And in this situation, we both want our children to have the best education, to learn how to read, and to read books that speak to them. And we want the books in the library to be appropriate. So we both want that. And I know that. So really establishing that common ground, as we pointed out numerous times, I think is so important. But we have different ways that we envision this common ground. So that's where I then would share my talking points. And a lot of times I feel there's so much misinformation out there about what's going on with a lot of these book challenges. And depending on what news media you listen to, you're hearing very different sides of the story. So I share my point of view on why these books are important and how it's important for children to see different points of view, different experiences. And I also share what I know about book censorship in this country right now and how the numbers have expanded incrementally. And it's not just one parent coming into the school who has read the book. These are mass movements with folks filling out numerous challenges at a time. So it's not, I think that surprises people a lot when they learn that it's not just one concerned parent. It's like a movement, and it's being very well organized. So I, whatever the talking points are, I'd share those. And then always, again, with just sort of closing it on that common ground and connecting emotionally. Like, I understand that you're upset that your child had this book, and I can see why, but also, here's how I feel. So how can we have this community space together where everyone feels heard and welcome? Like, what would that look like? So that's kind of how I've gone about it. I mean, with varying degrees of success, but I do find, like, once you establish, like, I'm a mom too, and I will sometimes, and I will admit there are things I don't want my child to read that he's not ready for yet, or what have you, and that's my decision to make, but I would not take that decision away from someone else.
I think about that earlier question we had about what to do when someone says something that's really strikingly offensive and upsetting to you, and to assume good intent, and to also one thing I think people may not be aware of, as Sonya said, when this is happening all over the country, and the really striking thing that we've noticed is that it's certain identities and certain voices and narratives, stories that are being targeted. It's the stories of LGBTQ people, and then as well some of our BIPOC characters and histories are being silenced. And I assume good intent and say, I have to speak up for those people. And I personally am not one of them, but I can't imagine that you would want to silence a person like that and make them feel unwelcome and make them feel attacked personally. So to sort of make the book personal, because the books are personal, you know, it is, we're talking about people's identities and people. I've had someone come up to me after a panel discussion where librarians shared their stories of having books censored. And I had this young person come up to us in tears saying, "It means so much to me that you are fighting for me." You know, people really do take this personally. And we're not just talking about books.
I think from working with children for so long, I often kind of do the same thing. And I think adults who don't work with kids on a regular basis, or maybe don't have kids anymore, forget that kids are so curious, so smart, so able to work through complicated ideas if they have someone who can support them and help them. And by getting rid of that chance for children to explore ideas and form their identities and become people, I think it's really sad that this is what's happening. And I think, you know, again, personally, I saw a question, and not exactly germane to this, but like I would not if I had to answer the poll at the beginning, I put myself at like a 6. I will tackle a hard conversation like this, and I am open to it, but I really don't like being bad at things, and I really like being right. And I know these things about myself as a person. And so when a parent, my brother and I couldn't be more different, and he has 2 little kids, and we talk about and his younger son loves to read, and we talk about this stuff all the time. And I love your steps, Sonya, of, you know, establish a personal connection, finding the common ground. And I think this does ask a lot of the person who is maybe maybe you feel attacked in that situation where you're like, whoa, like you are saying some stuff that I really don't like right now. But finding common ground for me is just a really important skill, and it takes a lot of practice. And I find myself trying to do that a lot. And because I also think about like long term, like, okay, I could debate and shut my brother down with how smart I am and how I know so much more than him and how I am right. But I also want this person to be in my life, and I want his kids to be in my life. And so I think, you know, there's a little bit more burden on the person who is thinking about how is this relationship going to be impacted by this? And what will I get out of entering into a debate with somebody? Sometimes it's just not worth it, and it just needs a
The other question is that I was just thinking about while we were talking, and particularly when it comes to school and children. I'm a former children's librarian. Is that what upsets an adult and what upsets a child can be very different things. And I don't even know if this is relevant, but I run a book discussion group with the Highlands in Topsham, which is a retirement community. And we read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn just because we wanted to go back to, you know, our childhood and read something that you know, we'd all read when we were kids. And as I was reading through A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, I thought to myself, I didn't know that was in there. I didn't remember this part of the book. And your perspective, my perspective as a 60+ person today is very different than the 12-year-old girl that read that book and loves the characters. And so I think having that kind of a conversation also helps people to say, the thing that hits you about a book may not be the thing that hits your kid.
Okay, we do have some time for additional questions from the audience. You all can go ahead and drop those in the Q&A box if you haven't already done so. I know we have some in here. We have one that is particularly weighty, so I will propose this one to our panel while others enter in questions. How do we advocate against book banning and on the principle of free speech on intellectual freedom, while also censoring, watching out for materials with points of view that are racist, homophobic, ableist, etc.? What is the balance, the tension there? How do you approach that and have both things be true?
Well, I like to remind people that the First Amendment is not carte blanche to say what you want. We also have protected classes. And that means somebody somewhere has drawn a line and said, okay, yes, you do have the freedom to speak what you believe. However, these groups of people or these identities are not included in this protection. You can't just say what you want, because I think it makes a lot of sense, but it, like Susan said, it's messy. It's not cut and dried. It's very shades of gray. But I do try to remind people of that. Like, yes, we do have the freedoms protected in the First Amendment. And there is this addendum that says these things are not included in that protection.
I also think that, I used to say this a lot more when I was talking with families and parents, but there should be something to offend everyone in a public library. And there should be something that offends me in a public library. And if I'm not offended by something in my collection, I'm not doing my job. We're not asking people to not read anything. The idea is not the thing that's going to hurt you. Knowing about it and understanding it is what's really important. We have all kinds of books in our library. We have all kinds of Bibles in our library. I have a Quran. I have a Catholic Bible. I have a Protestant Bible. I have, there's a richness there that is really important to thought processes. And it is messy. And that's why it's hard.
And why it's wonderful and exciting and always interesting to be a person who works with the public.
This is true.
Because, people come in with all kinds of beliefs and, I feel like my answer went like extreme to like the Constitution, but it's true. Like, we want in our hearts for these things to be true. I think they are instilled in every person that, this is like, here's your package. You're a United States citizen. This is what you get. And it's hard to not have your own interpretation of what that means and have it not be strongly held.
Right.
Also, I think there's something to be said for the marketplace of ideas, right? Mills and the economy. So like all ideas can be put out there, but only certain ideas are going to grab the trajectory of the community and be backed by the beliefs. So it goes to the publishing industry also. As librarians, we're using our collection development policy, and we're also reading reviews of books, both from publishers and from other librarians who have read these books and vetted these books. And I would dare to say that outright racist, anti-trans, hurtful books aren't rising to the top of what publishers want to publish. So it's would be upon us almost to have to go out and find these views rather than having them out in the open market with the things that are appealing to these audiences. And publishers are very smart. They're printing books that appeal to people, and not to say that they shouldn't publish all points of view, but they're savvy in what they're publishing, and that's a piece of it. That's a piece of it.
So you've all touched on books and books being in library collections and all of that, and to kind of shift back to conversations that we have with one another and ideas that are expressed. This has come up in a couple different permutations, so I think it's definitely something that's on a lot of people's minds. How and where do we draw the line between things that are offensive, opinions that are offensive, and perspectives or ideas that directly cause and perpetuate harm in some cases? For example, inciting violence or threatening groups. When it crosses that point, what is that? What is that line, and how do we draw that?
I think it's going to be different in every situation, because there is a line between talking and action. There is a line between thought and an actual physical activity. I think that in a civilized society, we need to be able to all pull ourselves back from the brink. And I think that that's something that we have lost a little bit of. I think, when Craig was mentioning Facebook, and, that you're not talking to another person, you're talking to a thing, an avatar. I think that we all in our institutions, even in our conversations, we have a place where we're going to go and we're going to stop. We have, and I guess maybe some people don't, but for me, when I start getting uncomfortable, when I start feeling threatened, that's the time when I say, you know what, we gotta pull back from this right now. And if it's whoever's in charge that given activity, if it's a meeting, if it's a conversation, we can separate. But it's tricky.
I'm feeling a little maybe out of line here because I'm not a librarian, and I'm on this panel with several of you who are. But I don't really look to my librarians to draw lines. Librarians, it's so between what is just an idea and what is inciting action. There's medical journals that incite action. Librarians draw one line, and you can find this line in any library, and it's the line between fiction and nonfiction, right? Every library has that. Your fiction books are in one place, your nonfiction books are in another place. And I think that is a great line, and that is a great public service that you are providing. I'm just noticing that and naming it. And other than that, I think the thing I love about libraries is that there aren't other lines. It's open access, all the good things that you've been saying. You are simply facilitating the marketplace of ideas and providing an opportunity for people to access books. You're not forcing anybody to do anything or cross any line that they don't want to cross. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking.
I'm also a former teacher of history, and so I can't help but think about how our opinion of an event is different today than it is in the moment. And when you look back on things, let's just take the American Revolution, for example. We can say, wow, look at these patriots who fought oppression to create a country that they wanted. Okay, sure. Not extrapolating this to any of the broader issues, by the way, but just saying, like, we look at that event as, like, there was certainly violence, there were certainly radical, unpopular ideas. There was a minority that fought a much better funded, much larger group and won, and all of those things. And I think that, again, is like really imbued in the American spirit, that the underdog rises to the top and wins. And so I just think, some of the events that have happened in the past several years, there's been violence from both sides. And it's easy to focus on violence and attacks and painful things that the other side is doing to you. But I think with some perspective, in 50 or 100 years, it might be evaluated differently. And we might see the points that either side was making. I think of like the climate crisis. And I just saw today that there were some climate protesters that interrupted a performance of Les Mis in Paris. And I was just like, wow, okay, this is like very interesting and really a lot of layers to think about. And people were upset about this action. But if, those people are trying to draw attention to a climate emergency. And so I don't know, this doesn't really help answer anything, but I just feel like, thoughts and opinions about events change over time, and perspective and space impact that.
I think we have time for one more general book conversation. So how should we highlight or talk about works, so books here, that are dated? Perhaps they contain things that we now, rightfully call problematic or just outdated. How do we talk about those things, or do we just remove those books? What do you do with those texts?
I would say there are two layers. One is if information in that book has been found to be non-factual, so it's full of things that have been proven not to be true, you would pull that book because you don't want misinformation. If it's not a matter of fact versus non-fact, libraries also all have weeding policies. We have our collection development policy, how we bring the books in and how we bring them out. So often what you'll find is that these dated materials aren't circulating. People aren't reading them anymore. So if I look at a book on the shelf and nobody has checked it out in 7 years, it's time for that book to move because we only have so much shelf space. So I don't think I would take a book out just because it feels dated, but if it's not earning its space on the shelf, it's time for the book to be withdrawn.
I loved all of Beverly Cleary's books, and I loved them to death. And I started to read them to my sons, and Mom was in an apron, and Mom didn't work, and Mom didn't do any of those things, and we had to wait till Dad came home to make a decision. And it was an interesting conversation that we had about, what is great about this book? What do we love about this book? And what is different today in our house?
Yeah, I think that is just the most important thing is, and I know it's my educator heart coming out here, but there is something to be learned from this. And we are trying to have an educated electorate. Meanwhile, our education system is in some ways, it's like a wheel going the opposite direction of capitalism. Like the point of education is not to promote any specific idea or product or anything like that. It's to explore, to have conversations, to debate, to work these things out, and maybe come to a consensus of some kind, if possible. So I think the best and highest use of those books really is as learning materials, carefully selected by somebody who can help people learn why it's no longer acceptable. If they don't, maybe it needs to be said that, like, not all women wear an apron and work at home anymore. And it might seem obvious to you, but it might not be obvious to somebody else. So I think they do have an important role. And personally, I have collected a bunch of books that are just somewhat offensive. And I'm personally just very curious, like, what role do these books have in our society? And I haven't worked the answer out to this yet, but I am ruminating on it and I think about it often. And I think it's exciting. I think we have a longer line behind us of written materials that we can, and other types of storytelling. Like it's just the possibilities are endless, but I think there's something to be learned from it. And I think it's really important that we don't lose that thread of teaching why that thing is no longer acceptable and explaining to people like, and again, my lens is for children because that's who I worked with. But I had many successful debates I taught a class on Islam, and we talked about terrorism and talked about different events. I anonymized them and I was like, is this terrorism or is it not? And it turns out it's not easy to answer those questions. You've got to look at all of the historical context and what role that played in the bigger picture.
Now, before we end tonight's discussion, I again want to invite our attendees to respond to a poll. And of course, this is going to look familiar, but please, give us your best response for how you're feeling right now in the moment. And while you're all responding to this, I'd like to invite our panelists to close with some final thoughts, and perhaps share a way that they personally can take care of themselves, some advice they would give on how you can take care of yourselves through difficult conversations that can be emotionally and personally taxing.
I think from my perspective, it's that you need to prepare. You need to think about these things before they come up. But also, I need to listen more, talk less, and breathe.
I'd like to offer a phrase. Show up, pay attention, speak your truth, and let go of the outcome. And it's the let go of the outcome part that brings me peace and is the way that I take care of myself. I cannot be responsible for how stuff turns out. I do my best. I show up, I pay attention. We could say I show respect, I bring my best self, I speak my truth, but the outcome is not all my responsibility.
I really take comfort. I mean, I'm a librarian and people think, oh, that's all about books and quiet. And really what it is for me is the people that I get to interact with and get to know. All those kids that I work with every day. And, a kid will come in and they'll have a sticker on their laptop and I'll think, oh. But then I get to know the kid and I get to know all these wonderful things about that kid. And I get to see a side of somebody that goes beyond that sticker and that political perspective or point of view. And I take a lot of comfort in just knowing that people are so much more complex and interesting than those veneers that we see on Facebook and on their bumpers.
Well, I can't love that enough, Heather, and that just sort of made me feel a little emotional because I think it's really so true, and nothing unique here to say, but I want to say what I would do is I agree. If you are your authentic self and speak your truth with kindness and respect, you cannot go wrong in this world. And it's difficult, it can be scary. So have an outlet that is the person that you can say the full truth, everything you think to. But when you're interacting with somebody you disagree with, it's just, if you are your authentic self, that's the best thing I can do.
Plus one to everything everyone else said. And I would just add, I definitely get by with a little help from my friends. So, we have these difficult conversations, and it's so important to have your support network that then you can say, hey, can you go for a quick walk with me? Can we have a cup of coffee? I had this difficult conversation and I'd just like to unpack it with you. And hopefully your support network is there to tell you like, oh, it sounds like you did this good and you did this good. And maybe next time you want to try this, or, it's just knowing that your friends are there to support you makes all the difference. And I'm so thankful that so many of the librarians I know are just so supportive to each other. And yeah, that makes me happy.
I want to thank you all of our panelists tonight for sharing their thoughts, wisdom, as well as the attendees who raised important questions, tough questions from their lives. Let's take a look at the final poll results. So it looks like a little bit of a shift here, which is great. Some feelings have shifted a bit. Others are still a little uncertain. All of these completely fine, expected. We hope that you will look at this panel as really just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We didn't expect to solve all the problems of the country tonight. But these are topics that, you can continue to explore with your neighborhoods, your workplaces, your communities, as we all grapple with this. How do we stay united as a state, as a country, against the intrusion of some of these extreme ideas here in Maine and elsewhere? In fact, Maine Humanities Council does offer a lot of resources to help you gather community in this way to do this sort of thing. So I just want to mention here that you can visit us at mainehumanities.org or reach out to us by emailing info@mainehumanities.org to learn more about those kinds of offerings. Please do take us up on that. Thank you all again. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to our attendees, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.